Before we start this podcast, I'd like to mention a charity that is very close to my heart, Auditory Verbal UK. Our son Henry was diagnosed profoundly deaf at 7 weeks old, and we worried that Henry would be isolated, ostracised, and lonely. Thankfully, we were told about auditory verbal therapy and how innovative and effective it was, and we signed up right away. AV UK supports parents to turn every single moment of every day into a listening and speaking opportunity. So successful is their therapy that by the age of 4 and with the aid of cochlear implants, Henry was talking on a par with hearing children and attending mainstream school. That transition from the first diagnosis to being a chatty, confident, gregarious 4-year-old boy felt and still feels pretty miraculous. Fast forward to now, he's going to university in September and the world is his oyster. Today, there are around 7,200 deaf children under the age of 5 in the UK who face a lifetime of disadvantage without access to early support. AV UK currently supports 80 families directly. The charity's ultimate goal is to enable all deaf children to have the opportunity to access AV therapy if their parents want their child to learn to listen and talk as we did. It is a small charity, and any donation will make a huge difference. To donate or learn more, please visit www.avuk.org. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of artists, performers, and rock stars of life. My guest today is all three and needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. He was only 19 when he and his band's debut single and debut album shot to #1 in the UK charts, something not even the Beatles managed. They were propelled to instant fame. That album and others went platinum, in fact, multi-platinum. Fast forwarding to today, they must surely win the prize for the hardest working, longest enduring band as they have released 18 albums and played over 100 gigs every year for the last 53 years. A documentary about the band is soon to be out. It's called I Need You, 53 Years of the Band America. It is a brilliant documentary and I defy anyone to watch it and not be in tears at the end. I was lucky enough to be a backing vocalist when he sang at our mutual friend, the one and only David Fitzsimmons' birthday party. And I can tell you that we, the Stax band, David's band, were all beside ourselves to have the chance to play with him. I'm slightly pinching myself that I'm talking today to America's Gerry Beckley. Gerry, I cannot thank you enough for being here today.
My pleasure, Katie. Good to be here.
Before we start going through your life, I'd like to talk a little bit about the documentary I was lucky enough to watch before the release. The world premiere was at the Newport Beach Film Festival last October 2024. It won the Audience Award, didn't it?
Yes.
So it's in the super league of rockumentaries.
It's doing very well. It's on that circuit. I'm new to this experience, really, but there's film festivals all over the country, and it seems to be winning something everywhere. It was just picked the best music documentary in Coronado down in San Diego, another red carpet in Ojai just north of LA the other day. And it's lovely. It's a little strange watching the story of your life. I'm not sure how many times I can watch it, but I'm very proud of it. I think they did a wonderful job.
And when and where will we be able to find it?
Well, part of the whole going on the circuit is you then get offers. It's all funded, made, and finished. And then you just show it to people and they go yes or no. And it's not really my concern or worry, frankly, because it's got an incredible response and I'm sure it'll end up. But it is the number one question. People say, where can I see it? And I'm sorry to not know yet.
Okay, well, when you do know, then please let me know and I can let our listeners know. Let's rewind to 1952. You were born in Carswell Air Force Base, Fort Worth, Texas. Your father was American, your mother English. Your father was in the US Air Force, and you moved from base to base and ended up in the UK. What was your first memory?
Well, my first memories are just outside of London because although I was born in Texas, Carswell is in Fort Worth, it's fastened to Dallas, I moved to Kenton in what was then called Middlesex. It's just near Harrow in the suburbs of London. I moved there when I was 1 year old. So I was there till I was 5. And so my earliest memories are of being in Kenton. And my dad was stationed here. My mom was born in Brighton. We'll get into that. So I'm half English regardless. But my earliest memories are putting on my little school outfit, my blazer, and going off to my first years of school, 4 and 5, before we then moved back to the States. I do have lovely memories, but the earliest ones are England.
And what about musical memories?
That's a lovely story because the house that we were renting, and I looked it up the other day, it's in Northwick Circle in Kenton. And I zoomed in as we can now, and then I saw a little circle. I'm like, oh my God, there it is. It was furnished, the house that we rented, and it had an upright piano in it. And my mother was a fanatic appreciator of music and really great taste. And so she always had vinyl playing. We had a hi-fi system. And I started fiddling around with the piano. Well, I'm sure I banged for quite a while. But as my dad would say that, I think he's quite keen on that. She said, not only keen, she said, I think he's playing Swan Lake. I was picking out, da, 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 da.
Yes.
And so good news was there was a piano there because had there not been one, I don't know how long it would have been before we discovered my interest. So I started piano when I was 4 because of that situation. And then when we moved back to the States, I took a series of piano lessons. We moved every few years. And so although I did learn to read, nothing really stuck because I didn't have a mentor teaching me. It was a different person every year.
Yes.
So anyway, it all worked out.
Certainly did. And how would you describe your family life?
Well, it was tumultuous because you have to relocate every 2 years or so. The strange thing about that is, I think for kids, at least for myself, you don't know any different. You're growing up and that's what you do. Not only that, but you're not the only weird kid at school that, well, where's he going? You're usually on a base and every other kid is in the same. So we all shared in this. But I think the problems with that are that much later on in life, I semi-joking with my wife will say that I'm homeless, meaning that there is no DNA in my upbringing that where you go back to this is where I was raised. And oh my God, I can't believe I would not recognize Fort Worth. And if I went to Kenton, Nilsson, I probably would recognize, maybe. But it's not embedded in your psyche and stuff. So that's a bit of a negative. But you get to see the world. Travel is not an unusual, oh my God, what are we doing? Every few years. In fact, I remember looking more forward to the trip than where we were going. I loved the idea of getting on planes and things. So it was quite an education for what eventually
what
became.
was to come.
Careful what you wish for.
Yeah. The fact that you're around families who were all part of US Air Force, was there any expectation that that's what you would go into?
Yeah, there might have been, but not by my dad or my mom. My mom, just lovely from start to finish. I have just beautiful stories to tell about them. One of the things that she found upsetting was having to relocate the children every 2 or 3 years and build a home.
Well, at the age of 15, that's when you came back to West Ruislip, I think, isn't it? So, in fact, I was thinking that you were kind of parachuted into UK life, school and culture, but you were very used to that already.
Yeah, because we would come back every summer. I actually moved back to England when I was 14 because I remember 67, 68 was my second to last year in school, and 68, 69 was my final year. So I was 14 and 15 in my 11th grade year, and 15 and 16. I finished school when I was 16.
When you came back, was that the first time
Yes.
that you met Dewey Bunnell and Dan Peake, and they were the other two that were to become the trio that is
Yeah, they
that
were
is
in
America.
the same high school. The school was, I love this bit, the school was called London Central, and it was neither. We weren't in London, and we were not central to anything. We were in a suburb called Bushy, which is up near Watford in Hertfordshire, North London. And my dad and as a family, we lived in a place called Carpenter's Park. And although it was really near the end of the Bakerloo line, so I could get into London, but it was far from London. Met Dewey the first year I was there, our 11th grade, what we call junior year of high school. And Dan came the final year. Small school. There was only about 100 people in each year of classes. And it was an old RAF base. It was all Quonset huts. So all of our classrooms were Quonset huts. So it was kind of unique. But that's where we met. There's kind of a social scene on these bases. There's usually a teen club where all of the students gather on the weekends. And I was in a band virtually every year, no matter where I was stationed. I came from Germany, and I'd been in a band there that was like the big band that played all the dances and things.
So how old? Because you were only 14, 15, 15,
I was
16.
13 in Germany, and so I was 10th grade. I had skipped a couple grades, which is another story. So I was a little bit younger than my fellow classmates. But I was in a band of seniors, and so I was 13 and they were all 17. But I stayed in touch with them over the years, and they said that I was the musical director. I would get tapes from the States. I would have, I think what it was called, like Casey Kasem's Top 20 Countdown or something, and I would have them mailed to, and I would work out what the top 20 songs were, and I would tell everybody, this is your part and this is your part.
Wow.
Yeah. So I was a bit of a pushy dude at an early age.
And then how did you get together and think there's going to be us three?
We played in bands together, but not all three of us at the same time in high school. And those bands were all cover bands. It was like, what is the top 20 songs? What's everybody listening to on the radio and stuff? And it was near the end of those years, in my senior year, that we started to rearrange songs. It used to be, how close could you copy the record? Oh, it sounds just like the record. But then, for example, the Vanilla Fudge did a version of You Keep Me Hanging On. Yes. Where they made it a ballad. Set me free, why don't you? It was completely different from the Supremes. You can take a ballad and make it an up-tempo, or you can reverse that. That I always like to mention is what I think was the stepping stone to composing, because you're starting to completely rearrange something. You didn't write it, but you're going, I want to take that bridge out. I hated that bridge always, and stuff. So all three of us played in bands like that in high school. We finished high school in 1969. Both Dewey and I stayed. Dan went back for one semester of college, which didn't go well. Dewey and I went and worked, the only real job I've ever had, worked at the warehouse in Ruislip, and I drove a forklift and loaded pallets.
That's quite a cool job.
Yeah,
when you're,
fine.
Not quite as cool as a job you ended up having, but still.
But we were starting to write songs. It was a lovely era because the first Crosby, Stills and Nash album had come out. James Taylor had 2 albums out. Joni Mitchell was becoming a superstar. So the idea of sitting with an acoustic guitar and kind of putting your thoughts down was nothing new. We all started doing it. Dewey and I realized we were both writing tunes, and then Dan came back and said, me too. So we just got together, and that's how it started.
You were doing sessions as well, weren't you?
I was doing sessions in London. I was doing quite a few sessions. I had met people through my few years here. I used to stalk the different studios because I wanted to see where the Stones had recorded or where the Small Faces might be recording. And I got to know these studios, and I started working at a place called Morgan Studios in Willesden in northern London. And there were a few people that hired me because I was adequate at a lot of instruments. I could play some keyboards or bass or guitar and sing. So I was kind of a go-to kid if you were cutting your demos. And of course, nobody had any money. And they would swap me studio time. And they say, well, look, we haven't got anything, but we can give you 3 hours of time if you will play some keyboards. And that worked out quite well for me because that is actually how we got in the door at Warner Brothers. That's a lovely story I'll tell you later.
That's how manager Ian Samwell came across you.
He's actually a staff producer at Warner Brothers. And I had done a session for a duo, not a session, I had been performing with them, a London duo, 2 singer-songwriters, and their tape was being shopped around, and it was at Warner Brothers being played for Ian Samwell, who was the staff producer. And he was listening, he said, I don't really hear it, this guy Dave Howson that was shopping the tapes. And then a solo came on that I was playing, middle 8 bars thing. And he happened to say, oh, that's pretty good. That's not bad. Well, what's that? And that guy, which I'm so grateful, he said, well, actually, he's not in the band. That's an American kid who was playing the sessions. He's got a band. And so Ian said, well, bring me that band. So that's how we got in the door.
There's a fantastic story of when you then got in the door and you played. Was that Dave Howson?
Dave Howson took us back to the same place, and we played for Ian Samwell, staff producer, by the way, to give him credit. Ian Samwell was a legend in the business. He wrote Move It for Cliff Richard.
Did he?
Yeah, so he'd been in the business a long time, and he was much loved and a wonderful guy. But we actually played for a guy named Martin Wyatt, who was the vice president of Warner Brothers UK at the time, underneath Ian Ralphini. Martin is to this day a dear friend, and I had coffee with him 2 days ago. And we went in and we played I Need You and Riverside and 3 Roses and stuff that became our first album. And Martin Wyatt said it was the hardest thing he ever had to do was to sit there with a straight face and not just whip out a contract and say, oh my God, sign right here. So he ran into Ian's office, and apparently he's told me this story a few times. He said, you'll never guess what's just walked in here. And so he was a huge fan from the start. We got offered a deal and made the album. But we didn't play him Horse because the Horse hadn't been written yet.
Okay.
But we did play him I Need You, which became our second big hit. It happened so quickly. We'd only worked like 6 months at this warehouse, and all of a sudden it became apparent, well, we can't keep doing that because we were getting offers to play. And Ian Samwell connected us with quite a legendary London figure named Jeff Dexter, who was a DJ, and he DJ'd the Isle of Wight Festival and stuff, and he did every Sunday at the Roundhouse. So the Roundhouse was one of the major London venues. It still is in Chalk Farm. And so he would put us on the bill at the Roundhouse. So I'm staying right next door to David Gilmour at the moment. And when I was 17, I was opening for Pink Floyd and stuff at the Roundhouse. And because we got signed to Warner's, it was not a lot of money, but it was enough for us to get a Ford Transit van and buy a PA. So we were on the M1 at least every weekend, if not more, up and down, playing every pub. So there's no shortage of gigs.
And you were in front of, well, Pink Floyd, Elton John, The Who, kind of almost immediately.
The record came out recently, and I didn't realize that it had been recorded, but it was quite interesting because we played a 30-minute set or something, and it doesn't include Horse. So I had to look up the dates, and it was a show we did at Wembley Cricket Grounds, at the Oval, not Wembley Stadium, at the Oval. And the bill was The Who, Rod Stewart and the Faces, and us.
Wow.
And there we are I think I was 17 or 18, playing. And anyway, so it's like, it got off to a pretty big start.
I interviewed Chris Difford from Squeeze.
Squeeze, right.
And he was very self-deprecating. He said, well, for 7 years, we were in a van going around playing in pubs to people who didn't want to hear us.
Yeah.
So, and I saw, because one of my questions is, what was your family thinking about this? But in fact, there was no worrying time about, is this the right job for you?
There was a month or two. There's a lovely story of when it was getting started. And my dad, to his final days, was our biggest fan. He kept the actual official America scrapbook. So there was never a case of what's he on about. And he was very proud of me. But he was a bit concerned about it being a career path. And he said to my brother, who was living in the States and coming to visit us in the summer, and he said, when you come over, I'd like you to have a word with Gerry. We're not so sure about this music thing. Give him a bit of life's lessons or something. By the time he landed, Horse with No Name was number one. So he said to my dad, well, now what do you want me to tell him?
Go back to that forklift truck.
It was a rocket ship that took off that fortunately we held on tight enough to not get scorched. We did okay.
Please tell me, Gerry, if I'm getting any of these dates wrong, but the first album you recorded at Trident Studios.
Yes.
And it was released in 1971. And that was initially without Horse, but John Peel was playing you on the radio, and you had your first televised performance on the Old Grey Whistle Test.
Yes.
Can you describe that?
Well, we knew what this was. We were fanatics of music, not necessarily the music business. I mean, we were learning the difference between Denmark Street and Shaftesbury Avenue and stuff. But for a few years, we'd been living in London, and we were shopping the music stores. Because as you might know, virtually every major label had an office here. And
yes.
I like to point that out, that it was Warner Brothers UK that signed us, which doesn't necessarily mean you'll even get a listen with Warner's in the States.
Right.
But we kind of knew a little bit about this. We were going to see bands with the Rainbow. I remember seeing the James Gang with Joe Walsh.
Oh, my goodness.
So we knew, but all of a sudden, it wasn't like, where are we? It was like, now we're there.
Yeah.
So it was a pretty good fit. There wasn't a lot of, we have no idea what we're doing. I've been playing in bands for 10 years. So it was just, we were now playing in pubs and better venues, very often opening for pretty cool things. There was a lovely English band called Family, Roger Chapman, very charismatic frontman. And they were huge here and big in Europe. So we got on Family's UK tour and traveled around, and they had their own PA system. And we thought, oh my God, that's really cool. And there was one time, we used to play with Brinsley Schwartz, which was Nick Lowe, his band. We were huge fans of Brinsley Schwartz. And I remember one time, I think it might have even been Aberystwyth, but we were headlining. And there was just a singer-songwriter before us. And he sang a song or two, and then he would tell these anecdotal stories. And they were so funny. You almost didn't want the story to end. And then he'd do another song, and then he would tell another story. And it goes, because it's a lovely thing about this. The promoters would say to him, Billy, the songs, they're okay, but your stories are really fantastic. Maybe you should think about, and it was Billy Connolly.
Oh my goodness.
He had been a member of a group called the Humble Bums with Gerry Rafferty, and they were a duo.
Oh,
and
gosh, I didn't realize that.
The Humble Bums was Gerry Rafferty and Billy Connolly. And I was a huge Humble Bums fan and Gerry Rafferty fan. Anyway, so that's the kind of people. We did a lot of shows with John Martin. We're always asked. We never worked with Nick Drake, but it was of that Nick Drake era. Once we were on a major label and had a real release, we got Cat Stevens' European tour. So we played with him at, I think, the Palladium or the Royal Festival Hall or something. And we went to Vienna and Frankfurt and Munich, and we were opening for Cat Stevens. Yeah, it was fantastic. And I was just a kid, so it was pretty cool.
Absolutely. So you release this album, that Horse isn't on it. It's called The Desert Song, and then you re-release the album with Horse with No Name on it. How did that whole thing fit together?
It's a little bit complicated, but one of the elements is really strange and lovely, is that we did the album, and they were thinking, okay, we need a single. Maybe I Need You, maybe not. Maybe that's not the best. So they considered I Need You. They then happened to say, because they knew us, we were there every day hanging out. Have you got anything new? Have you got anything else? And we said, well, yeah, there's always something new. Why don't we go in and cut that stuff and we'll have a listen? Now, you know that the label would never do that. Now, they wouldn't fund an album, release an album, and then right away say, have you got another, few songs?
Yeah.
But we just thought, sure, why not? It didn't seem that unusual. And we went in and cut 4 things, of which The Desert Song was one of these 4. And it was the weirder of the 4. The others were very good songs, 1 or 2 of mine and Dan's. And Dewey had this one song. And they listened, and we learned this lesson. The label said, well, it's got to be that one. And we were not surprised. It wasn't like, really? We just took it. So having the label tell you what the single should be is a lesson that I learned very early on, that don't necessarily fight that, because they're the people that are going to be working your record. And if you force a song on them that isn't the one they think is the... So anyway, we couldn't get Ken Scott. He wasn't available. And we couldn't get Trident. So we ended up going into Morgan, which I knew very well, with a different engineer. But Ian Samuel and Jeff Dexter and ourselves, and we cut it. The album wasn't reissued here. They were separate things. The single was pressed and released. The album was pressed and released. And when the single went right top of the charts here in the UK, and we did Top of the Pops and all that stuff.
Yes.
Now Warner's in the States said, oh, well, maybe we should consider putting that out. And they said, well, it'd be lovely. And they said, would they consider coming over for a tour? And we said, of course, are you kidding? We're American. We'd love to come and tour. So Warner's UK sent what they call the parts that you then press not happening to mention that the single wasn't included on the album. And Warner's in the States just pushed go, pressed up 100,000 records and 100,000 copies of the single or something without realizing that the single was not on the album. So it's one of these strange things where the collector's versions are the ones that don't have the hit on it.
Right.
People have that album. And so anyway, we went to the States, and that's where it all blew up pretty big.
I know. And actually, I just want to take you back a little bit, because I forgot to ask you, and it's the question that I know everyone always asks you, which is the name America, because you couldn't be a bad band and have the name America. So it's not like you're calling it Table or Dog's Breakfast. And in fact, David's brother Malcolm, I don't know whether you've met him. So Malcolm joined for a few years a band that were called Absolute Crap. Oh. So they would stand on stage and say, we are absolute crap.
It's a good joke.
It's a good joke. But
better
America...
hook the mics on, otherwise even the joke won't work. Yeah.
But America, most powerful country in the world. Yeah. Why did you choose it?
Well, there was already a group called Chicago. Chicago originally called Chicago Transit Authority. CTA, which is the name of the subway system there. Okay. And their first album is Chicago Transit Authority, and they very quickly changed it to Chicago. There had very briefly on CBS, they came and went, a group called the United States of America, and they had disbanded. And so we thought, if you can call it the name of a city, I suppose you could call it America. And so we thought about it, and then as the story goes, Dan and Dewey were working at the cafeteria in the base, and there was a jukebox. There's a famous jukebox called an Americana. I think it's a Seaberg or a Wurlitzer. And they thought, oh, it's a sign, America. But more important, I think it was a way to tell bookers and people who we were, because there was a lot of bands gigging around, a lot of guys sitting on stools, playing their hearts out. Yes. And so by calling ourselves America, it's, oh, that's those guys. That's those 3 American guys. So it was a little bit of a good gag.
Yes, it was. And then America goes to America for this first tour. And what reception did you receive there?
Well, it was great, but some of the irony was direct from England, America, a lot of the posters. So it's like, well, wait a minute.
Yes.
And if you dig in and say, okay, no, so what's going on here? You guys sound American to me. I would say, well, we just were living there. So that part's true. But if you really want to get thick, both Dewey and I have English mothers, we're both half English. So it all got a little bit muddy. But, and I suppose that's in the no press is bad press kind of thing.
No.
But we were booked to do a club tour opening for different people. And the first two cities, which were Washington, D.C. and Boston, we were booked to open for the Everly Brothers. And then we were scheduled to go to New York and open for a very highly regarded comic named Robert Klein. And comics were a big thing by this point. Woody Allen had made a name. You could really be a star as a stand-up comic. So our first show in the United States was at a famous club called the Cellar Door in D.C., which is no longer there. And we were booked, of course, for 30 minutes to play before the Everlys. And the Everly Brothers were legends to us. At this particular time, we didn't really know who these people were, but it was Waddy Wachtel on guitar, who went on to just countless other great platforms and things. Now I think he's playing with Stevie Nicks. But Warren Zevon was the keyboard player in the Everly's band. And it was both Don and Phil and their dad, Pop Everly. It was really the whole package. It wasn't like, oh, you should have seen them a few years back. And they were fantastic. And we would do our set and go out and watch the Everly Brothers. And people would watch a couple of songs and leave, because all of these lines around the block were to see these three kids, because Horse was blowing up on the radio. And I mean, really, if you turn the dial, you'd hear, oh, there it is. And then you go to another station and it'd be on another station.
Oh my gosh, that's really, just
it was
crazy.
Going nuts. So that was really great for us.
And you weren't expecting any of this?
No, but to be honest, there's a part of you put out a record and it goes up the charts and you go, yeah. It's only when you have 5 or 10 failures that you realize, I think this one might actually be happening. But for us, it was happening. And we went to Boston. And when I say a week, I think it might have been Wednesday through Sunday or something. And we show up in Boston, and the Everlys had mysteriously got ill and canceled. And it was a famous little club called Lenny's on the Turnpike. And the guy, he said, look, it's just you. And we said, and actually Phil came on his own. He said, well, I'll do a few songs. And the owner, Lenny, said, look, the phones are ringing off the hook. Don't worry, you're going to be the headline. And we said, well, we've only got 45 minutes tops. Play a few covers, stretch it out a bit. And he says, no, it's okay. I've got this kid from college, stand-up comic named Jay Leno. He'll do 20 minutes. So I did a week with Jay Leno in February of 72 at Lenny's on the Turnpike. And then it just got bigger and bigger from that. We opened for Robert Klein in New York, in the Village, which was lovely. That tour ended in LA at the Whiskey A Go-Go. And we were headlining by that time. There was no need for us to be an opening act.
Wow.
And LA is kind of known, the singer-songwriters would always play the Troubadour. It was a legendary club. And our manager, Jeff, at the time, the Troubadour was famous for having options, meaning, well, I'll let you play, but you got to commit. No matter how big you get, you got to come back and play 2 more times. And we didn't like the idea of options. And we said, it's got to be somewhere else to play. They said, well, the only other major club is the Whiskey. It's famous. The Doors, the Byrds, everybody played the Whiskey. But not Be Quiet singer-songwriter things. And I said, no, we can handle that. So we did a week at the Whiskey, sold it out. It was fantastic. That was the end of that tour. The album and single hadn't gone #1, but we got on a plane, and by the time we landed in England, they were both #1 simultaneously in the States. Pretty big deal.
Wow, it was #1 in the States and in the UK.
Well, it had tapered off in the UK now. We were 3 months.
But it had been.
We went back to the UK, and we were welcomed back as heroes. Little Warner's UK, which basically, no matter who they signed, wouldn't have ever even get releases in the States, now had an act with a #1 album.
Yeah. Well, so I have a 19-year-old son. He is now on a gap year. He is in Cambodia at the moment, and he's having, I am sure, a wild time. And I think the age of 19, you feel you're invincible and you're not necessarily at your most sensible. But he doesn't have a #1 record in stadiums being sold out. And I would imagine the screaming girls might be beginning to start. How did you handle this? It was instant and it was huge.
Yeah, well, the next few steps were lovely and quite important, because what we did is we came back here in a bit of shock, to put it mildly, but in
Yes.
good shock. It wasn't like, Jesus, what have we done? It was really great. And Warner's UK was incredibly excited, and everybody had plans, and we just happened to get a call. We knew who David Geffen was. David Geffen and Elliot Roberts handled, as a management company, virtually all of our heroes, Crosby, Stills, Nash, Joni. Elliot, in particular, had Neil Young and Joni Mitchell. So whenever they would play here at the Royal Festival Hall, we would go. I remember meeting David Crosby at the Festival Hall when I was just 17 and stuff. We knew who all these people were. Dewey got a call one night from Leslie Morris, who was Elliot's right-hand man, so to speak. And Leslie was the beating heart of that whole organization. And she said, I just got off with David. We'd like you to come to LA. We think this is where silly for you guys to be there. You've got a #1 record. You should really be here. You should be with us, which meant leaving all of our team here, meaning leaving Jeff Dexter, leaving Ian Samwell. And they said, look, we'll send you some tickets. You guys come on over, see if you like how it feels. And so we went, okay, we'll just get these tickets and we'll just go check it out. And we didn't tell anybody at Warner Brothers except Derek Taylor. Derek is an entire episode on his own. He was the most wonderful man, and he was head of Apple Records. He was the Beatles press officer for most of his career, and he had now ended up at Warner Brothers, head of what they called special projects. But he was a dear friend, and we met the Beatles through him, met Harry Nilsson, lots of other things. He was our confidant at Warner Brothers, so we whispered to him, I'm going to go over and stay with Geffen.
And what did he think?
And he said, Godspeed. And we went, didn't tell anybody. So now we move into Geffen's house in the Hollywood Hills, and Joni Mitchell was living there. And Warner's UK, as you would, were checking in with us daily. How's their #1 band doing? And none of us were returning any calls, and they couldn't get us on the phone. So it caused a panic at the label, to the point where Derek, who'd been sworn to secrecy, said, everybody calm down. They're fine. I know where they are. Well, where are they? They're at David Geffen's house. Oh, crap.
Which is the second bad news.
Yeah, oh, no.
It's like, at least they're alive, but they're with him.
That changed everything, because Geffen said, let us show you how we do it. And one of the things that Geffen and Roberts, to their credit, had established, because they were handling, David started by handling Laura Nyro, who was not only a genius, but a very challenging person, personality-wise, to corral and to deal with. So he knew about eccentricities, and he knew about artists and stuff. And one of the things that was a bit of a surprise to me was, oh, no, you don't talk to them. You don't talk to Rolling Stone. They don't get to talk to you. He put a wall around you, which was protection. And he said, first of all, I'm going to put you with this business manager. And we said, we thought you're the manager. And he said, no, we have the personal manager. A business manager is going to take care of the money, because there's a lot of money coming. Good, that's good. Okay, businessman, noted. And we're going to put you with this law firm, because you're going to need legal. And to this day, I'm with the same law firm and the same business manager.
Okay, so that was great advice.
So it corralled us and protected us. So that's really the answer to how did you handle it? And I think that went a great deal to protecting us.
Yeah. Okay. You're out there. Joni Mitchell is your housemate. And first time round, you're writing these songs. There's no pressure. You're thinking, this is what we want. And then suddenly you are the #1 band. You're 3 good-looking guys. You're the hottest band musically and visually. And then suddenly you've got to come up with another album. Was it huge pressure, or was it at the age you were, you just took it on the chin and carried on?
It's called the sophomore jinx. When you have a big success, it's very hard to follow it up. In addition, we were nominated for 2 Grammys, and the Grammys, I think, were maybe Record of the Year and Best New Artist. And the Best New Artist is an interesting list, because unfortunately, if you read through, it does read very much like a list of one-hit wonders, because there's so much pressure to go in and make this second album. I had right away met some friends in LA, musicians and stuff. Brian Wilson came to the
Beach Boys.
Whiskey. And we got to know these people, and a dear friend named Bill Mooney, who was an actor, but also a musician. He was in Lost in Space. He said, we've got a little band. You should come to our sessions. So I went to the record plant, and I saw this fantastic studio. So when it came time to, okay, now we're living at Geffen's, and we've got to get a follow-up record. We better get in the studio. So I booked September or whatever it was. I said, I know where we should go. We should go to the plant. It's lovely. I was just down there. And it was not like, what are you talking about? It was like a legendary studio. And what about a producer? And I, although they're credited to being produced by America, I was doing most of the producing. And I knew at the time, I said, I got this. I've spent it's about 3 years in a row in studios. I know what that knob does and stuff. I really don't need anybody. So we booked the record plant for a couple of months. What we didn't have was a rhythm section. So we're in LA, which has all the greatest musicians in the world. And we wanted Russ Kunkel and Lee Sklar because we knew of their work with Carole King and James Taylor. And they passed. They weren't available. And it could possibly have been that they truly were booked at the time. Although there was a possibility of maybe we didn't rate, or, these guys were superstars and they were playing on Jackson Browne. And wait a minute, who are these kids? So our office came up with these two guys named Hal Blaine and Joe Osborne. And we didn't really, as Dewey admits in the documentary, he says, I didn't know who those guys were. But Hal Blaine had drummed on 5 consecutive Grammy Record of the Years. He drummed on the Carpenters. He drummed on Fifth Dimension. He drummed on Bridge Over Troubled Water. Joe Osborne was the bass player on Bridge Over Troubled Water.
So they were okay.
Oh my God, were they not only okay, they added so much. The couple of loose little bolts in the whole thing, all of a sudden, it's just perfect. Not only that, we're in Studio A at the plant. And right away in Studio B, across the hallway, block booked out for that year, and seemed forever, was Stevie Wonder.
Oh my goodness.
And so we got to go into Studio B every day, and we got to know Bob Margouleff and Malcolm Cecil were producing Stevie. And we got to go in and listen to some of the most pivotal music of the 20th century,
yes.
Superstition and stuff like that, being cut about 10 yards away from where you're sitting and stuff. And then he would come in, and Margouleff, who was programmed...
Stevie would come in.
Once or twice, I think he came in. But the producers came in and would listen. And I'd got myself an ARP 2600 synthesizer because I figured I could figure this out. I was out patch bays and things. And Margouleff came and said, get out of the way, please. Let me show you how to do that. So they were really a help in many ways, rather than just, boy, we had famous neighbors. And we assembled our 10 or 12 songs, and it included this lovely little track of Dewey of his Memories of California. And I thought, this is a really beautiful song. What if we put a little lick, put a little to start it off? And we all said, oh, that sounds good. That's a great idea. And it was Ventura Highway. So we did this album, and it had Ventura Highway and Don't Cross the River, a country song of Dan's that was also a big hit for us. Not only did the album go smoothly, but it actually sold more than the first album. Although it didn't go to number 1, it stayed on the charts longer or something. Double platinum. And Ventura was a massive hit.
Immediately you know which song it is with that first lick. But didn't they not like it at the beginning?
We came back to the UK, and I can't remember the encounter, but I think it was with Jeff Dexter. And I said, we've put this little... And he looked and he said, oh, you've ruined it. I don't think so. I don't think it's good. And that turned into a story in itself, that lick, because many years later, it was sampled by Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who were producing many things, and Prince and Janet Jackson and stuff. And I know Jimmy quite well. He's a big fan. And he built an entire song for Janet around that guitar lick. It's called Someone to Call My Lover. And it's a number 1 record for her.
The second album is even more successful than the first, so you guys are really flying. The fan thing must have been huge. What kind of crazy things were they doing?
The word is fanatic, right? So that's where fan comes from. So it can be a challenge.
Actually, I know what? I didn't realize that. That's where it comes from.
Yeah, that's where it comes from. So by this time, when we were living at Geffen's house, for example, Crosby would come over. He was best friends with Joan. And I had met him once briefly at the festival hall and stuff. And by this time, our album is very well known. There was a bit of a rub with Neil because Horse sounds like Neil. And now Neil's a little upset because Neil's manager happens to sign us,
yes.
Right? So Neil's a bit bristly, but he's always very sweet to me. But Crosby was legendarily wise ass of a guy. Dear friend, by the way. And anyway, that's another story. But I remember meeting him at Geffen's, and I said, oh, David, we're big fans. And he looks at me and he goes, well, that's obvious. So we had that kind of encounter. But we also had the watch and see how it's done. Jackson would come over and swim by the pool. And so we kind of saw how you navigate. Troubadour was kind of the opposite of off limits. It's where the safe place to go. You're not going to get hounded at the Troob and stuff. But otherwise, you have to be careful. And within a year or two, we were all over the TVs and everything. And there was a particular story. For example, I remember we were playing LA at the Universal Amphitheater. And by this time, I'd moved to the Hollywood Hills. And I had a car to take me back home after the show. And backstage, I get in the car. And the driver says, "We're being followed." And I looked and I said, yeah, I saw that. We're being followed. And he says, "Leave it to me. I'll lose him." And so this guy takes us on a somewhat wild through the Hollywood Hills. Not dangerous. Like, what the hell are you doing? He's trying to lose. Yeah, we've lost him. We're good. And I thought, okay. And we finally get to my house and we pull up. And the car, the people who were following us were already there. They were waiting out front. I mean, they knew where I lived. So they were trying to follow the car, and then they realized, well, forget that. We know where he's going. Yeah. So they beat me to my... So there was that kind of thing, which is humorous and anecdotal. But I would rather think of that than the rare occasions when it got a little bit weird, which on occasion got a little weird. And we had security for a while and stuff, but nowhere near the problems that some people have had.
People were generally quite gentle.
Respectful. Yeah, in fact, we had still do have lovely fans.
Well, in fact, something that came across in the documentary was how loyal. Some fans are covered with tattoos of your songs. But yes, they seem like really lovely, more gentle folk, perhaps mirroring how you guys were.
You know what? I don't think that's a misrepresentation. It's not like they searched to find the 5 nice ones.
No.
These people come. There's one guy, Tom, that's in the documentary. I don't really know him well. But after COVID, when we went back out on the road, there was a bunch of shows to do, contracts that had yet to be fulfilled. 50-some shows. He went to every one of them. He flew all over the country. That kind of devotion. You go, yeah, there's Tom. So that's good.
Dewey got married very young, didn't he? And then Dan got married as well. I don't know how you had time in all of this.
Me either. Which, as you know, I didn't get married.
You didn't get married.
Yeah.
Your guests at parties would be David Bowie, Harry Nilsson, Ringo Starr, Carl Wilson is a great friend of yours. So for those of us who are not going to be going to those kind of parties, to be a fly on the wall, what kind of scenes would we have been witnessing?
What I did was I bought a house in the Hollywood Hills from Mike Nichols. He directed The Graduate, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf with Richard Burton and stuff. Unbelievable. But I bought the house from him, and I bought it furnished. So I never met him. And I had now a house in the Hollywood Hills. So when these parties come up, there was never a case of, I'm having a few people over. I thought this was just one of those places where people gathered. And because I was single, it would run a little later than normal. There wouldn't be the, sweetheart, can you get all these people out of there? But another thing that I don't mind mentioning, I'm sure he won't mind, but I got to know Ronnie Wood very early on. And Ronnie and his first wife, Chrissy, were living at the Wick in Richmond Hill. So I was coming back to London a lot, and I would stay at the Wick with Ronnie.
Okay. How did you meet Ronnie?
I think we met Chrissy at the Speakeasy one night, and she said, "You got to come back to the Wick." So we come back to the Wick. A week later, you're stumbling out of there. So Ronnie'd love to meet you. And so they would stay at my house in L.A., in the hills. So not that I didn't know these people on my own, but I tell you what, if you have Ronnie as a house guest, the buzzer starts going more. And so, full disclosure, the few times that Bowie was up there, it was usually coming up because Woody had invited him up. But Harry was a dear friend. Harry would bring Dr. John. Ronnie, oh God, there was an endless list of people. And Brian Wilson would come over. Brian famously didn't leave his bedroom, which I know not to be true, because he would show up at my door quite often. I have lovely memories of these, but it's a case of get that out of your system while you can, which I did and survived it and stuff. I think Dewey often talks about, Jerry's was the place. It's an interesting time because Woody was still with the Faces. He actually got the call to be in the Stones while he was at my house, because I remember the call.
Are you with him?
Yeah, and he put the phone, and it was pretty common knowledge that he was, if not the top of the list. They needed a new guitarist, Mick Taylor had left, and there was a bunch of other names. But when I was at the Wick, Keith would be staying in the guest house down the back, so I knew they were close. Anyway, he puts the phone down and goes, "Dewey, I'm a Rolling Stone." So it was right at that time. Rod was best of mates. This was, I think, when Rod was with Britt Eklund. And so Rod would come over with Britt Eklund. And there was one time in particular when Dewey just happened to be out one night with Linda Blair from The Exorcist. And he came in, and we're all having a gatho, as they say in Australia. And I don't know if it was Rod or Britt, and they had just seen The Exorcist, and they see Linda Blair, and they freak out. And, oh, my God. So there were things like that would happen on occasion. But in general, everybody was well-behaved and got home safely.
You then have your third album, Hat Trick, and then after that, George Martin, who is the Beatles producer, becomes your producer. How did that come about?
The third album didn't do as well. It went gold, but it didn't have a big hit record on it.
Which, of course, anyone else would be thinking, oh my gosh, lovely. You've got a gold record.
Yeah, that's ironic. But anyway, so the third one didn't do so well. And I remember discussing with the guys, because it was really falling on my shoulders producing. And I did enjoy it. But when you're also writing and touring and doing as many shows, it was a lot of work. And I thought, if we can get the right guy, I think we bring a producer in. Because that way, 11 at night, if we want to go home, we can go home and we're not worrying about labeling the boxes and, okay, who's going to make those mixes that we wanted. All of those more annoying parts of producing. And so we all agreed, okay, that'd be a good idea. I wasn't forcing it on the guys, like, I've had it. You know? And Dan said, yeah, sure. And the way we tell the story is that we made a list and that we had George Martin was at the top of the list. But to be honest, I can't really remember who else was on the list. It wasn't like, and right below him was Roy Halley, who'd done Bridge Over Troubled Water or something. So it turned out that, first of all, we all knew every aspect of George. It wasn't like, get that Beatle record, and who's the producer again? George was a legend because his involvement with the Beatles was the opposite of transparent. The lovely cellos, Eleanor Rigby, and the quartet for the
Was that George? That's George's
all
input.
George. So it wasn't whereas you listen to Gus Dudgeon, who had done a lovely job with Elton, but the strings were Paul Buckminster. So two different people. Yes. That's far more the norm, rather than the producers also writing the charts. But in this case, one-stop shop. And so we thought, well, we could ask him. And so our office reached out, and it turned out he was either in LA or coming to LA because he was nominated for an Academy Award. He had done Live and Let Die, the Bond soundtrack with Paul. And so it was up for soundtrack of the year or something. And so he was in LA. So we had a meeting with him, and it was lovely, and it couldn't have gone better. I don't know how much. Did you ever meet George? He was a lovely
I didn't.
Man. He was equal parts, very much of a Prince Philip, stately, handsome, upright man, mixed with Spike Milligan.
That's a nice combination.
Yes, incredibly and diverse, but equal parts, because he could really hold a room and just speak very well and everything. But he had been Parlophone's comedy producer. He produced The Goons, Peter Sellers stories and stuff, and Harry Seacombe and Jonathan Miller and all of these fantastic people. Famously, that's why the Beatles took to him. They knew his name because he'd produced a lot of their favorite comedy records. So anyway, we had a meeting with George, and he said, well, this sounds doable. It sounds lovely. He said, the only thing I ask, would you consider coming to London? He said, because our last album had taken 2 or 3 months. And he said, I really can't be gone that long. He said, but I have a beautiful new facility. He had built the first Air Studios. He had finished his EMI contract after years and years at Abbey Road. And he built Air Studios, and it was in Oxford Circus. It was actually almost in the roundabout. 4 floors up, you looked out over. And we said we would love to come. Dewey and I are half English. I had by this time bought a place. I had a home in Sussex. So that's how we got with George. We went over to do, and we started at Air Studios, and we had a pre-production meeting. And he said, I love this part of the story. He said, I've held 2 months in the studio. I don't know, see or what room we were in. He said, I'm not saying we'll be done by then, but he says 2 months, good chunk of time. Let's see how we go. And we did that first album with George. We did it in 14 days, start to finish, which was included overdubs and mixing.
Wow. So
he sat us down and said, boys, and this is in the documentary, he said, it's just been lovely. He says, it's been so great. He says, I have to say, it can't possibly be a success. He said, nothing that easy could ever be a success.
Can actually work.
And it had Tin Man and Lonely People.
Yes.
It had massive hits for us and stuff. And so we were off on what became a 7-album journey with George.
What was his impact? What did he bring?
I love the years that I spent with George because it was such a learning experience in many ways. But when I have to boil it down, I say what he brought was focus. Because you get kind of hung up in well, let's try that. We'll see. And nowadays, I don't say we all had synthesizers, but there used to be like a TV used to have 13 channels. Then all of a sudden you got 246. The notions, and you could see why people's recording schedules were getting longer and longer.
Yes.
People were becoming more and more of a perfectionist, and let's do it again in 30 takes and that kind of thing. We did this album, we were cutting 2 or 3 tracks a day that were take 2. And he'd go, well, it sounded good, boys. And we go, yeah, good for us. But because there was a guy that we respected, it wasn't like, are you sure? If George Martin is telling you, that sounded great, lads, you tend to believe him. But I also must mention that sitting right next to him was the engineer, Jeff Emmerich. And Jeff came with George. Jeff was George's engineer, and he had engineered Abbey Road. He'd engineered Sgt. Pepper. He later went on to engineer Band on the Run. We had the two of them, this most competent. So much as I'd like to say it was us, we were very well prepared. They also had that end of the thing down. There was just not a second. If somebody had an idea, it was right, and it was on tape before it even cleared in your head.
Left your head.
That worked. That was good. Yeah, it's a good time.
One of the albums you did was As Hearts. You produced that with George, and that was Sister Golden Hair. You know, it's the first note.
Yeah.
Think, oh, okay, it's
got
Sister
a good
Golden
intro.
Hair. Fantastic intro. You're never going to mistake it for anything else.
It's a good trick for those struggling songwriters. If you can't come up with a clever intro.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you wrote that.
I did.
And then Daisy Jane was the hit on that album as well.
It's a good album for me.
It's a fantastic album. And then you were touring, and I think there was one tour that was cancelled. Was that because you and
Dan and I lost
voices?
our voices? Yeah. And by this point, the rocket was blaring. If ever you look at that footage of Elon Musk or when somebody launches and the thing is like, that's kind of what was going on with us. Sister Golden Hair was a #1 record. So much as we had had 10 hits by this point, we hadn't had a #1 since Horse. So now we had a #1. I do like to mention that album, the second one with George, we did basically in Sausalito in California. Now that he knew that it wasn't going to take him 2 or 3 months, he said, well, where do you want to go? So Dewey lived in the Bay Area, and we hadn't done an album near Dewey. Dewey always had to move and go somewhere. So let's go up to, there's a record plant up there. So we did Hearts in San Francisco mostly. We overdubbed in LA, and then we came back to Air to mix it. But it was not a long process again, a little bit longer because of the location changes. But we had a #1 record. So not only did we have our second #1, but George Martin had a #1 record. I love George and I love Judy and the family, and they had brought so much to our world that I can't stress enough how much joy that brought. Because here was this immensely talented guy that was doing wonderful work after the Beatles. Talk about a perfect fit. The Beatles are a perfect fit, and he was the right guy and the fifth Beatle and all that stuff. We all know those stories. But he was doing other lovely projects, but nothing was really sticking. He wasn't back in the charts. And all of a sudden, with these 3 young upstarts from in the States, he was back in the charts. He'd had hits with Tin Man and Lonely People. And then Sister Golden had a #1 record. And I was proud of it because I wrote it and sang it and stuff. But I was also, I hope you get what I'm saying, is I was so happy for him.
Yes.
Because all of a sudden, he was actually quoted in this, so I'm not telling secrets, but he made more money off his work with America than he did with the Beatles.
Did he?
Yeah, because his deal with EMI was so poor. It was 1.5 points of this, and we had a real deal with Warner's that allowed substantial points to go to a producer if he was worth his salt. So we were selling millions of records, of which he was the producer. So that did correct itself when the Beatles did the anthology projects, because he had the long overdue right to renegotiate his. So he did very well at that point. But anyway, he was now rented a house in the Hollywood Hills, and he got a big Cadillac convertible and stuff. And so I just
That's such a great feeling.
Yeah, I love that. And to be part of that was really a treat. And so it turned up the pressure. I mean, now we had #1 records and stuff, but it was also a wonderful time. I don't ever like to paint any of it as, oh, that's when it turned dark. It just became a little harder to hold on to. I think one particular year, because we followed up Hearts with a Greatest Hits album, which went to #2 forever. And it was a true Greatest Hits. Every song on it was a massive hit, whereas a lot of Greatest Hits records are...
Which is incredible, because you guys are early 20s still,
yeah,
aren't
we've already got a Greatest Hits.
Yeah.
I like this part of the story. It's #2. It never got to #1 because #1 for virtually that whole time was Chicago's Greatest Hits. And one of my closest friends is Robert Lamb. who's the main singer in Chicago. So anyway, I'm happy to defer to his greatness. Say, hey, I was fine with number 2.
You go on tour and you then have to cancel that tour.
Yes.
And I think it's around that time that then Dan felt that he was losing control of his life and decided that he was going to step away.
Yeah, we did 2 more albums with Dan, but it was becoming harder and harder because he was wrestling with demons. I don't like to get into too much detail, but all the usual rock and roll stuff. And we loved Dan, and he was a equal third. It's very hard when a stool is a strong 3-legged stool. You know, you take one of the legs away. But also it was killing him. And so it really turned into the case of those albums didn't do so well. We did an album in Hawaii with George and Jeff Emmerich, and it was a lovely experience, and we all learned to scuba dive and stuff, but the album didn't sell anything. And Dan would do all-nighters. He'd spend all night partying, and Dewey and I would show up at 10 in the morning and tell him all that we'd done. And he would look at us and go, sounds great. I really want to hear that. And we'd say, well, you would have heard it if you'd have been there. You know, it was that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So the time had come, and it really, I think, did save his life because we couldn't work with him in that shape. We couldn't take any bookings because he was just in no shape to go on the road.
Was there ever a point where you felt that you might have been going down that road?
I got close at times, but nowhere near. I think Dan was the winner in most of those contests. In fact, what I was going to say is that year we had 3 albums and I had a bit of a breakdown. No, 3 albums on a world tour. And I collapsed in Japan at the end of the world tour. I'd produced a David Cassidy album, Somewhere in the Gaps.
Oh
I was producing other acts by this point. So I was busy, very, very busy. There was not a minute's oxygen, to be honest. And then we went and toured, and that was 1977. And I remember in Japan at the end, I was just a mess. So I went to my cottage in Sussex and had a couple of months of, let's regroup here. But that's the closest I got to the wheels coming off.
Yeah. Well, the albums kept coming, 18 in total. No single band, surely, has toured more than you guys. 53 years, 100. So that's 2 a week. There's no let up in any of that. I put it into ChatGPT, my new best friend,
right?
Who said, who was the longest running band? And they actually came up that it was U2, and it was 48 years.
Yeah.
Thought, no.
There you go.
Wrong.
See, that AI stuff, that can be
It's not
inaccurate.
it has a way to go. But other rock partnerships like Simon and Garfunkel, they had 3 years and then they'd split up, and then 3 years and then split up. And I guess that's normal, because if you're a creative person, and then someone is fiddling with that, it's an environment that's ripe for falling out with each other.
It's not uncommon in each group or each duo or whatever. Their stories will vary, but there's common denominators of, I'm sick of that guy or something.
Yeah. So what was the secret for you and Dewey to last this long?
Because I've thought about this a great deal. I love saying this. The secret to a great partnership is having a great partner. And I just really hold Dewey in with the highest regard. He's been so lovely to work with, and he's deferred to me at times when I'm adamant about something. And I am so happy to defer to him. He's not a crazy man. He's incredibly bright. He's very funny. We lean the same direction politically. We don't have to keep things, or we won't bring that up and stuff. We both are half English, so we both get all of the British humor, the Python-esque stuff. So we have kind of our own language. So that's made it a gift. It was never a challenge. In fact, just to fill in a little bit of a gap, after our George Martin years, and everybody said, what was it like Abbey Road? And he said, well, we never worked with George at Abbey Road. But coincidentally, the next thing we did with a producer was with a guy named Russ Ballard, who had written this song, You Can Do Magic, for us. So all of a sudden in 82, we had another massive hit, but we did that at Abbey Road. So we never worked with George at Abbey Road, but the next guy we worked with, we were in Abbey Road. So we said, here we are at Abbey Road. So there were lots of lovely extra details like that along the way. But maybe most important to what you're asking is that we built up a career and a name as a live performing act. It wasn't one of these every 4 years we go into 6 weeks of rehearsal and put it together. We just kept at it. And even though there were lulls and peaks and valleys.
I mean, it doesn't look like it,
I remember doing a tour of Australia where we were playing just working men's clubs. And it was a fantastic tour. We had rent-a-cars. We never bottomed out. It was never now what are we going to do? The phone's not ringing. The phone was always ringing. It just might not have been offering quite as much dough as the year or two before. You know what I mean? There was adjustments you had to make. We did have a plane for most of the 70s. That had to go. Those planes are quite expensive. But in general, there was never a shortage of work.
That's quite a grueling schedule
Yeah.
to set up for yourselves year after year, that number. I mean, you could have done 30.
Do you know that number is a lovely, nice round number, and it's an average because there were times when we maybe did 120 and times we did 78 or 80. But it's relative. If you had Mike Love here of the Beach Boys, he would tell you that they're doing 180 this year, and it's a quiet year for him because there's certain people that view, well, there's 360 days in the year. Tommy Emmanuel will be playing 355 of those. He goes every day. So it's relative, but we found that 100 was something that we could manage. One thing we did change was instead of going out for 2 months in a bus and bye-bye, kids, bye-bye, we've switched to weekends where you'd go on a Wednesday or so, play Thursday, Friday, maybe Saturday, come home Sunday. So it's a good news, bad news situation because you're home every week, which you never were before in the lengthy tours, but you're also in a coma. You get home and you just collapse. And you somehow manage to have a good meal Wednesday night before you get on a plane again and go do it again. 100 shows a year is 200 days of travel. It's about double. So in theory, 164 days off a year. What real job ever gives you that much time off? I had a situation one time where it was a lovely story, but we were asked to play with the Beach Boys at Washington, D.C. at the Monument. Every year they would do this massive free show on July 4th, our country's anniversary. And this particular one was the biggest one they ever did. And there was, some counts said, as many as 800,000 people. And when you're called America, you're in demand on the 4th of July. So it was always a big booking for us. And we had accepted one in Casper, Wyoming, a big fireworks display in one of the western states. And we were asked by the Beach Boys if we could join them on this one in D.C. And we said, well, we'd love to, but we're playing completely across the country. And they, as they know, they're professionals at this, they said, yeah, but if you got a jet, we could put you on first and you could get in the jet and fly with the sun and easily make your Casper, Wyoming.
Oh,
so
God.
we flew into D.C. on the 3rd. We got a Lear jet and we flew into D.C. They put us on first in D.C. where we played for, some say, it was at least 500,000, maybe 800,000 people. It's just, you have no idea. Helicoptered back to the jet. By all those people, flew across the country to Casper, Wyoming, where we played to, I think, about 35,000 people. A lovely night display of fireworks and everything. And since we had the jet, we flew home. And I was in bed before midnight.
Oh, my goodness.
And my wife at the time, my ex-wife, she said, well, how was your day? Yeah, this is interesting.
4 seasons in one day.
Yeah.
Well, actually, 4 places in one day.
That's an extreme example. But in general, it's, you go, you connect in Dallas to somewhere to Indiana, you play a theater or performing arts center, and you get up and repeat and do it again.
Yeah. Well, your brilliant documentary, I Need You, 53 Years of the Band America, charts your final gig. It keeps going back to the beginning and then it comes back to today, your recording studio and Dewey and he's mucking out the horses and
our
whatever.
Different lives.
Yeah, your different lives and then coming back together again and then your last concert when you're actually up on stage, you say, right, this is going to be the last one. Fans are crying. I was crying in my living room. How did you feel?
Well, I felt pretty good, to be honest, because it's something that I had been working towards. And I don't want to say that this was completely my idea because when I had to really have the heart-to-heart with Dew, I said, I'm done for a variety of reasons. And he said, Jer, we'd done 53. And I was 71 at the time, and he was 72. He said, I always thought that I could make it till I was 75. He says, but now I'm not sure I could make it another year. So he says, I'm with you. So we spoke to the office and we said, well, we'll call it a hiatus because if you call it a retirement, you're doing 1 million interviews about blah, blah. But a few things. First of all, you can't just do that. If you're doing 100 shows a year, the phone is ringing constantly. And the reason we had to make that call was unless you do, next year will fill up. Because the shows I'm doing right now were booked a year ahead of time.
Yes,
and stuff.
of course.
So all of a sudden, these very lovely promoters and people that had been booking us for 10, 20, 30 years were being told no. What do you mean no? No, they're not taking anything. Well, that leaked out to the fans. And the fans who are trying to book a year ahead because they want to get the good seats are being told, no, we've just been told they're not. What? So it kind of was leaking out a little bit. But you know who didn't know was the documentary crew that had been following us around for 2 years. And I said, guys, we got to tell them, because you don't want to.
So they weren't doing the documentary because it was
They
coming
didn't
to
know.
an end.
No, they didn't know.
know.
So I said, we got to tell them. And because there's still a month or two to go. But what it meant was what was supposed to just be the last show of our year. It happened to be in LA, a lovely, lovely venue called the YouTube Theater. It was going to be the last show. And so they then had to go back to the producers and get more money because they needed to really shoot this event. I don't think it was even on their schedule to shoot it. So that's how it came about. We had to tell all the people that mattered that this is it. We're going to wrap it up. And Jim said, let's call it a hiatus, because how many acts have you heard of that say I'm done, and a year or two later, I'm back, and I'm back. I knew we'd all been through COVID, and the way I put it is COVID was a test for all of us in the business that we all had to take, that none of us asked for, but we all had to take anyway. And that is, the test is, what would you do if you can't do what you do? Now, I wasn't at all in question about, I'd really like to wrap this up. I thought 50 years, nobody's going to complain about 50 years. It's a lovely round number. You're going to disappoint a few people, but 50 years, that's good. But unfortunately, 50 years, we were in the middle of COVID. And there was 100 shows on the books that all got canceled and rescheduled.
Okay.
And we'd been paid for most of these shows. We have to be paying in advance. It's good news. And so it all had to be done. So which is 50 turned into 51. There was no shows. And then 52, now we're making up these shows. But during COVID, 15 months of no work at all, I'd speak to my friends. Russell Hitchcock's a dear friend of mine. He's in the group Air Supply. And he said, how are you holding up? And I said, great.
Really
I was
happy.
doing a solo album. I had got to spend more time with my wife in Sydney. I had to go through quarantine and stuff in Sydney.
Oh gosh, that was a long one.
I was confined to a hotel. Anyway, that's another story. But one thing I realized that it didn't surprise me was I didn't miss it at all, getting on stage. And Russell said, oh, not me, mate. He says, 10 days in, I didn't know what to do with myself, which is far more the normal response to that. If it's what you do, and you really, I don't say you need, but you just love the back and forth with the audience. I had a half a century of that. There's not like, geez, I was just getting it down. I felt that for me personally, it was going to be the law of diminishing returns. My voice was starting to go. I didn't want to start seeing bad reviews. I was tired. You wake up in the morning, geez, it's going to be tough. I did have a test, which I like to mention because they're a dear friend. I got a call in Sydney a year or so back from Brandon Flowers, is the lead singer in the Killers.
The Killers.
And he's a good friend of mine. And they were coming to play in Sydney. So, great. And he's always been so kind and gets for my kids and stuff. And he said, would you consider doing a song? And I went, yeah, I guess. Geez, sure. And I said, well, what? And he says, well, Sister, or you can do Magic. And he says, we'll figure that out. We'll work that out. I said, yeah, okay. Now, the Killers are an arena act. It's 20,000 people. And so I know they're on tour, and I'm watching their schedule, and they're playing Brisbane and stuff. And it's getting near the Sydney shows, and I haven't heard from him. Did I dream that? I look at the text, and it says, no, we're talking about what song. And so the day before the show, he says, you ready to go? And I said, yeah, sure. And I said, what are we doing? He says, Sister. We got to do Sister. I said, okay, great. So we had lunch with him that day. And the next day, they're playing Kudos Arena. It's beautiful, but it's out of town a little bit where they had the Olympics. And they do this thing called a sound check, which I've tried to avoid my whole life. Where you go,
you
and
must
you
have done a fair few anyway.
Yeah, which I've done. And so I had to go out and do the sound check. And I'm looking at the arena and stuff, and I've played countless arenas. First of all, we were running the song, and he had a huge band with 3 girls and everything. And boy, did they know it. They nailed it. They did
I've seen
good.
it. I saw it on
it's a lovely
YouTube.
clip.
It's such a...
But,
you guys rocked.
And he's going to float it in the middle of the set. And I'm thinking, okay, this will be all right. And then we were watching the Killers, and the Killers show starts on 10. The confetti cannons are boom, and he's out there, and he's like a preacher. And now I'm starting to think maybe it wasn't such a good idea to float this cute little number in the middle of this dynamic. And so I knew where it was in the set, and I got to leave my seat, and I had to inch my way by a few people that are a bit annoyed to make room for me. And I go
less
down,
annoyed
and I'm
when
in
you
the
were inching
wings.
your way back.
And he gives me a lovely intro. He said, this guy's a legend in the States, and he's now splitting his time in Sydney. Please welcome. And I get a lovely reception. But I don't want to wait around because I'm thinking we better get into this. And as you mentioned earlier, it's got the greatest intro. So I start it. and the place goes nuts. And so Brandon and I sing Sister. It was lovely, and I'm just
It's
full
fantastic.
of myself, and it was just a warm feeling. I think, oh, well, that went well. And hugs all around, and I leave. And now when I'm getting back to my seat, those people are up and they're ready to let me back. But the point is, there was not a notion of on stage going, oh, this is what it's all about. I forgot. In fact, if anything, it was a reminder. No, I'm good.
You're done. Can we just do 10 rapid fire questions?
Sure.
And I've actually tied them to the titles of your albums. So question number 1, Hearts. Who has been a mentor or an angel on this journey?
I have had the good fortune to have got to know and become very close with my idols in this business. And I would include George Martin, who I ended up in, other than the Beatles, probably the longest working relationship with that man. I had the greatest respect for him. The composer Jimmy Webb is one of my favorite songwriters. For those who don't know, he wrote Up, Up and Away, By the Time I Get to Phoenix, Wichita Lineman, MacArthur Park.
Amazing
I sang
songs.
By the Time I Get to Phoenix in my high school junior review when I was 14 or 15 years old. We turned out to have the same business management office, so I got to know Jimmy very, very well. We toured together. He's the godfather of my first son.
Oh, gosh.
And so it's quite annoying when you're a songwriter and you know people like Jimmy Webb, because you're sitting there putting your 3 or 4 chords together and you look over at Jimmy and he's built some Bavarian castle of a masterpiece, you know. But I would rather have it that way than the other way around and not get to know him. And then I think, if I may go back, I would say Derek Taylor, who was like a father to me for the few years that he was around in our career. But he had been in the States. He had been the Beach Boys press officer. He famously told Bruce to take a copy of Pet Sounds over to play for Paul and John, because he knew how much the Beatles loved Brian Wilson's work. And we lost Derek to cancer many years ago, but when he was on his final journey, he handwrote a list of who he wanted at the funeral, and it was a very small list, and it's a very prestigious list, and I'm on that list. And I couldn't go because I, of course, was playing a casino in Reno. But I was so honored to realize that I had made enough of a mark with this guy. So I'll go with those 3.
Well, You Can Do Magic. I know that's not an album title, that's a single, so I've messed up already. You've been really generous and given us some magic moments. One pinch me moment, if you just describe one.
I had finished, we had done an entire summer with the Beach Boys where it was all stadiums, and sometimes 2 stadiums. The demand for Beach Boys shows was so high that in the summer that they would very often do 2. They would play in Lexington, Kentucky at 3 p.m. and then get on a private jet and go to New Orleans and play New Orleans at 9 p.m. Then you get on the plane and you fly to Miami where you're playing the next day. So you're sometimes 3 states. It was hectic. But we did a particular summer with the Beach Boys where Dewey and I, of course, would mooch a ride on their plane as often as possible. They had hired for this entire summer the UNLV, University of Las Vegas, cheerleader squad. 12 girls that were dancing, you know, be true to your school on the set. Audrey Wilson, the matriarch of the Wilson brothers, was still alive. And when we landed in Los Angeles, the private terminal, all the big limos are pulling up and there's all these hugs. And Carl was my dearest friend, one of the Beach Boys. And as we're all saying goodbye at the end of this summer, I remember saying to myself, I don't think it could be any better than this. I can't imagine any scenario. And I was right. But the best thing about it was that I was wise enough to notice it and to mark it, as opposed to, boy, I wish I'd known at that time.
Yes,
I would have, you know what I mean?
of course.
I remember at that moment going, remember this, because I just can't imagine it being anything better.
Yeah. And you were also on the Starship, Elton John's
I used to
plane
travel
as well.
Elton had a wonderful scenario where the Starship is this beautifully huge jet, and he would base in New York at the Sherry Netherlands Hotel. And by having a jet, you could hit Boston, D.C., Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. There's a bunch of things that you could hit, and you get back on the Starship, and you'd be back in this. So he could stay in New York for 2 or 3 weeks, play all these major cities, and I tagged along on a few of those. You get a number, okay, Gerry, you're in number 13. And what that meant at the end of the show, when you hear Crocodile Rock, you're in the 13th limo. You have to get down there and be in the limo because they're not waiting for you. Nobody's going to check limo number 13 to see if little Gerry heard the song or not.
Heartbreak. What about a low moment?
I haven't had a lot of lows, to be honest, because I've been incredibly fortunate. But losing Carl, I was very close with Carl, and Carl was the youngest of the three Wilson brothers. He had lost his brother Dennis. The middle one died before that, and I was close with Dennis. But I was very close with Carl. Carl took me under his wing right when we started. Carl was 15 at the start of the Beach Boys.
Oh my goodness.
And I think that he clearly saw in me a lot of what he had to go through. This young kid, you will never hear a bad word about him. He was just the most loved guy, and he's the voice of God Only Knows.
Oh,
And,
is he? I didn't know that was him.
That's not Brian, that's Carl. And Good Vibrations. He sings those songs. He had the most beautiful voice. And I was in the middle of a project with him at the time. I was doing an album with Robert Lamb and Carl called Like a Brother. It's called Beckley, Lamb, Wilson. And we were almost done with it. And Carl was diagnosed. And the good news is, the bad news was that it was not a long journey. He was gone within a year. And the day he passed, Gina, his widow, called me and said, would I give the eulogy? Which I did. And that's not easy to do. But I was incredibly moved to be asked. And it all went very well. But I've often said to my boys, to my family and stuff, that, because he was way too young, he was 53 or so, I think. And I don't want to say myself, I never recovered. You never recover from losses like that. But that's one of the lessons you have to learn. Things like that are going to happen, and you don't recover. These are the scars that we carry, and some of them are real visible, and other ones are a little bit more secret.
Yeah. Back pages, regrets?
I don't have a lot of regrets. I tell you, if anything, I look back now, there's so much I'm still in the middle of doing that the regrets, if I had to word it as that, is that maybe I didn't allow enough time to chip away at these things that I now want to do. I don't want to say my days are numbered. One of the reasons I wanted to stop at 70 was I'd like to think I have a decade of health. I don't want to presume, but I've got my own knees, my own hips. I've got a loving family. I don't want to be annoying. And now what are we going to do? He's around all the time. But I'm busy. I'm in pre-production to direct a film. It's a lovely documentary about popular music in the 20th century, and I'm looking forward to that, and all the pieces are falling into place. I have a few scripts in my head that are developments. I produce other acts. I produce a singer-songwriter named Jeff Larson. There is a new Jeff Larson album coming out. This one says Jeff Larson with Gerry Beckley, because we realized that by putting my name on it, we can charge a bit more. So,
And you've written your own album, because I've been
I do a lot of solo
listening to
albums.
it.
I do every few years, I do a solo album. I'm pretty prolific. I'd like to score more. Okay, regrets. I wish I'd had a little bit more time to score things, because I'm a fanatic of the way that music integrates with the visual arts. And I was a Morricone fanatic. Ryuichi Sakamoto, who we lost recently. I mean, these were people that wrote some of my favorite music.
Homecoming. You split your time now between LA and Sydney. What does each place give you?
Well, they are two halves of a whole, because I spent my entire life moving around and traveling. And like I said, even though I was based in LA, I had a home in Sussex. I first saw Australia in 77 when we toured there on a world tour. And I remember looking, going, this place is awesome. The beach house in this little town was $200,000. Are you kidding me? This is incredible. Never realizing that 20, 30 years later, I would be living there. But Venice, California, I've always loved. I didn't ever live in Venice because I was raising kids and it was a bit sketchy. But the minute I was single again and stuff, I moved right to Venice. First of all, I was right by the airport, so that's a help. But I live in two gems on this planet that I'm so fortunate. Now that my time is a bit more my own, it's lovely to design a year that isn't revolving around those 100 shows that you have to kind of navigate. And so my wife and I are off to Greece tomorrow, in fact, a place that neither of us have seen and we're dying to do. And so stuff like that.
Here and now, a top day for you today, what would it look like?
I would walk and shoot in the morning. I've spent a lot of time focusing a bit more on my photography, which was always a hobby. And I openly will admit that if I had another lifetime, I might be pretty good at photography.
Well, I've seen some of your photographs and you are really good at it.
I really enjoy it, but I'm just learning. One of my sons is a professional photographer and he's incredible. But Henry Diltz has been one of the mentors to me. He just showed me the passion of walking around. So my cliche thing is that music really taught me to listen. Most people just listen and tap their foot. And I'm listening to what the hi-hat's doing and listen to that bass player. He's skipping the downbeat. I can't just listen. And photography taught me to see. And I now look every day of like, oh, wait a minute, sun's over me. So I should come back in a couple of, that kind of thing was never an issue. So a day would include a morning of that. I would get out and shoot a bit in the morning. And then I would write a little bit. I write every day, but I'm not one of those, you've got to do 2 hours. I'm just drawn to it. Now that we have these computers in our pockets, I'm always scribbling down notes and things. That can happen at any time, but daytime is ideally the better time for me to get it down. I have exact same studios in Sydney as I do in Venice. And then I really look forward to, because my wife works, she's a beautiful and successful designer. And so come evening, she loves food as much as I do. So either I'm treated to the most incredibly made home-cooked meal, or I get the honor to take her out, and maybe with some dear friends, like we did last night with Dave and Danny. So I love that. And beyond that, I'm an early riser, so I'm not up late at night. I am a movie fanatic, so it might include one of the classic films.
Been any particular one?
I have the Criterion Collection, so I've just been going through the Sight and Sound top 50 director's poll of all the greatest, which is a lot of predictable. But when I am asked that, and I'm not one for top 5 lists, but I would put Being There, Peter Sellers' Being There, is probably near the top of my list, which is a Hal Ashby film. It's where he plays Chauncey Gardner.
Gosh, I'm going to have to watch that because I haven't seen it.
Masterpiece. Peter Sellers, he said it was the role of his lifetime. He was nominated for an Oscar for it. I have a friend who was an extra in that film who told me stories about it. But Hal Ashby did Harold and Maude, and really a legendary director. But they were all at their prime, and it's a fantastic film.
Wow, well, I'm going to see that. I've never heard of it. Silent Letter. Dan passed away in 2011. If you could bring him back, what would you like to say to him?
I'd love to have a real chat with him because, as Dewey mentions in the documentary, he was not only bright, he was really funny. And I think that's one of the things that Dewey and I still have that we can hold on to, is we have the same sense of humor. And there's just so much, and it's dark humor a lot of times. It's like, oh my God. But Dan was part and parcel of that. So if I had Dan back for a day, it wouldn't be a quick discussion. It would be pretty lengthy.
Horse with No Name, not an album. And this is a really deep question. If you had a horse, what would you call it?
I have a lovely way that I wrap my thoughts around this horse. Because we used to joke and say, well, we call him Frank and we rode him to the bank. But at the risk of being overly emotional about this thing, that particular song and that horse is what took us all on this journey. And it's not like I don't ever let him forget that. Dewey knows I'm aware of it. And much as we've had all kinds of hits, who knows if it hadn't have started with the spark of that Horse with No Name. I will tell you that Dewey and his wife adopted, they always say, don't say rescued a horse. They adopted a horse, a wild Mustang, which they have named No Name, no name. So there is a horse in our circumference, but it's not mine, and they're a great expense. And I'm glad I dodged that passion.
There was something incredibly special about that song, because even today, and it's one of my favorite songs of all time ever, that I can't listen to it without having these images of the wild desert, epic movies, incredible images.
Shows you, there you go, is a great example of the power of music, a power of song. But also, I will tell you, because there are equal parts, what's he on about? There's all this surreal. Andrew Gold, rest in peace, famous songwriter who wrote Thank You for Being a Friend, a dear friend of ours. He used to say, I'm okay with the plants and birds and rocks. He says, but the things, plants and birds and rocks and things, he found that quite annoying. What I like to mention is that although the song is legendary for its surreal content about, oh, what's he really, it's just about, some thought horse is a slang for heroin, so they thought it was a drug reference. But more importantly, the chorus is la, 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 la. The song builds in a respite for you. And so we have done that song in the four corners of this globe. And I recall being in a bull ring in Quito, Ecuador, 10,000 feet in the Andes, where 15,000 people in the bull ring started going, la, 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 meaning people can sing it all around the world. So yes, it's cryptic and what's it all about, but there's enough of it that anybody can sing it. So great.
It is. It's amazing. Your move, what key message would you share with young musicians today?
It's a tough time for musicians today because we have the combination of almost unlimited outlets that didn't exist before, combined with incredibly short dead ends. There's really no record labels anymore. You can't get signed for 5 album deals, all the things that were part and parcel of my growing up. I lectured at Loyola for many years and talked to students studying to be in the music business. Yeah. And I would speak of my experience. And to be honest, between you and I and our listeners, I was at a loss sometimes to put a good spin on it because it was very hard to figure. Then the way I would word it is kind of a global, you all are going to get to redefine what this business becomes. Because part of me had no idea really what it was going to be. But the one thing that I do share with everybody is have faith in your own originality. Have faith in the weirdness of yourself. Because much as we will all be, whether we want to or not, we will all be a super group of all the music. I'm as influenced, for example, by Lionel Bart, who wrote Oliver, the musical, because I grew up with that musical, as I am by Brian Wilson and Paul McCartney, because you're a super group of everything that you listen to. So you're not going to escape that. But what do you bring to the table is yourself. And boy, it is far better to stand or fall knowing that what you're presenting is truly of you and by you, than to be passed on or skipped over because you listened to somebody who told you, this is the song you ought to do. You've really got to be honest with yourself. And so, unfortunately, that's not a guarantee. It doesn't really shorten the journey, but I think it makes a far more stable platform to stand on.
Okay, no, that's great advice. Okay, perspective, the extraordinary life you've led, the things you've been able to do, the people you've met, the highs and lows. If you could tell, not musicians, but tell people one thing, just one thing that you've learned, what would it be?
It would be to enjoy the moments, because these moments come and go. And I guarantee no matter who you are, you're going to have some great ones and some crummy ones. But if you make the critical mass error of not making note of the great ones, boy, you're denying possibly the only oxygen that you're going to have. I do have something that in this last week, I was watching a lot of footage of Jonathan Miller, who was a legendary British director of theater and a doctor and a member of Beyond the Fringe and comedy writer and stuff. His whole life was unbelievable. And I was also reading the autobiography of Keith McNally, who's a famous New York restaurateur who did Balthazar and Odeon and a lot of New York's. But one of the common denominators I found was these were two men incredibly successful at what they did. And it's not a bitterness at all, but there was a certain amount of didn't quite get it or a certain amount of frustration or something that I found common. It turns out they were both good friends, were good friends. Jonathan passed away. And I thought, boy, I think the lesson that I've learned in following this is not that I needed a reminder, but hold on to the great moments and make them count. You don't have to run around and yell, did everybody see that? But just try and make a mark because, man, it's fleeting. And as you know, as you start to add years, these years fly by.
Just had to tell you a story, which is that my daughter the other day, every Sunday night, she and her friend Ella, my daughter's Anna, have the evening together and they play records. And so she, on Monday, said, I've just found this amazing song. You're going to love it. And anyway, I listened to it and I was able to go back to her and say, I sang that song with the guy who wrote it. Oh. And it was Sister Golden Hair.
Oh, far out.
And in fact, it turns out that actually what they're playing every Sunday
it's good,
are
right?
America songs.
Yeah.
So the next generation, what's so lovely about what you do is that it's just going to keep going and keep going and keep going. And you have made and are still making such a difference to people's lives. And so before I let you go on your holiday, another album, you've been very kind to interrupt your holiday by talking to me
it's my
today.
Pleasure.
But another comment was from David, actually, to your answer about how lucky you were to have Dewey. David said, the thing about Gerry is that I've never heard him say a bad word about anybody. And that's very rare.
Let's project more. He's a lovely man.
But thank you so much for talking to me today and also just for touching us all with your incredible music.
My pleasure. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B., Head of Marketing, to all of the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.